All right, Micah, the floor is yours.
Oh, all right. Thanks. Thank y'all for being here tonight. We're going to do a work session. It is joint BOC, PC, and BOZA. Attorney, I guess is new. This is your first planning commission meeting, I believe.
First Planning Commission meeting,
First
yes.
planning commission. All right. Well, new attorney is Mr. Patrick Carter. We've had several conversations with him, I guess, in the last month or so since last meeting. I will let him do a full introduction on himself and then get started with that. We are going to do just a quick rundown of procedures of meetings and so forth, and then powers of the Planning Commission, BOZA, and then Board of Commissioners for the same items that come through Planning Commission. I know that was a training that was requested last year, just kind of what's our job, what are we supposed to do? And whenever Mr. Carter came in, I asked him if that would be something that he would help prepare. So they prepared two different PowerPoints tonight that we'll just run one right after the other and kind of go over Robert's rules and procedures, and then the duties of Planning Commission. So I'll let you do your introduction and run from there with it.
Sure. I'm Patrick Carter. I met some of you just before we started, and others. I know we have a Board of Commissioners here, which I met last week, and then BOZA members. Who's a BOZA member? Okay, good to meet everybody. I've practiced law in Columbia for 23 years. I've done a lot of city work over that time for the cities of Mount Pleasant, Murray County, and then Spring Hill for the last almost 10 years. It's hard to believe. So excited to be here in Fairview, even if it's Valentine's Day night. So with my law associate here, Josh Hogan. Josh is going to talk about Robert's Rules of Order, and we've arranged for the city to purchase Robert's Rules books for all of you, because ideally that's how we should be running our meetings. It really is the best way to assure fairness and due process. And so and it helps because the meetings are organized and typically will flow quicker if we follow those rules. And typically the applicants and the citizens feel like they've been heard and there's a sense of fair play. So I'll let Josh start with that, and then I'm going to talk just about 5 common legal issues with land use planning in the city context. And we'll go through those pretty quickly, and then we're happy to answer any questions. And I know that we have our Planning Commission meeting at 7. It doesn't look like it's too long of an agenda, so hopefully we can implement some of the things we talk about at that meeting. You'll find inside your book is a cheat sheet that I created actually for Spring Hill several years ago, because we had gotten into a bad routine of really not making appropriate motions and everybody talking at the same time, which leads to disorganization and chaos. So you'll find that, and I always keep a copy with me generally to help me too, because there's a bunch of rules and it's hard to keep up with them all the time. And sometimes it's hard to remember which votes require just a majority and which votes require a 2/3 vote. So anyway, I have found that helpful both for myself and the different boards in Spring Hill. So without further ado, I'll ask Mr. Hogan to run through his PowerPoint, and we can talk about that and have a conversation about that as he's going through, as you have questions if you'd like.
Hello, good evening, everyone. So I'll move through this pretty quick, but feel free to stop me if you have questions at any point. First, what is Robert's Rules? And in its most basic form, it's really just a guidebook. It's a framework for how to run your meetings and a standard procedure for how to make decisions as a group. It's based on the concept of parliamentary procedure, which is very, very old, so obviously it must be good. But if we go to the next slide, why use it? Other than the fact that it's old, that is a benefit because it's been used for so long. You know that it's been vetted and it's been developed over a long period of time. The biggest thing with Robert's Rules is only one thing is being discussed at a time. There's only one motion on the table. There's only one item of business that's occurring. And what that does is create a very clear record of what you do in the meeting. And obviously that's important when you're conducting public business for what happened that day. The other thing that it does is it protects everyone that's in the meeting, not just the majority. You have to have a quorum present, so that ensures that everyone's adequately represented, and everyone should be allowed to speak in the meetings. So that protects the rights of the minority. Even if they don't get their way at the end of the vote, everyone's had a chance to say their piece and be heard on the matter. You can go to the next one. So this is Robert. It's not a history class, but a little background just for context. This was published in 1876, the first Robert's Rules, but the work that went into it was before that. So the story is, when Mr. Robert was an Army officer, he was asked to preside over a public meeting, and he was very frustrated by the lack of consensus about what should or shouldn't be happening. And as he traveled in the Army around the United States, he found that was common in all local assemblies. So he undertook a study of what Parliament's procedures were. And just like the common law, it wasn't written down in any one place. Parliamentary procedure developed over hundreds of years through the actions of Parliament. So it's all these separate actions that took place over a long time. So Mr. Robert studied all of that, and he was the first person to codify, all right, this is the set of rules that Parliament actually uses. And after he took the time to put it down in writing, it was quickly adopted everywhere, because that's what most people were striving to do, and now it was there. Here he presented a written procedure and framework that everyone could use. So that's where it comes from. So I'll talk big picture and then a few details on actual procedure, but most of the work of the meeting happens prior to the meeting. As you know, there is some type of need that's brought to the organization, whether it's the Planning Commission or the Board of Commissioners, whether a constituent brings it or it's an action that the body wants to take. That's an input to what's going on at the meeting. Your ongoing public engagement, the research that's done by your staff, and the reports and recommendations they provide, and all of that coalesces into a motion. A motion is what you're asking the organization to do, the action you want to take. After that receives a second, it goes on to debate. And during that time, that's when subsidiary motions can be made, like a motion to amend or defer, and eventually you'll end up in voting. At the end of the vote, you'll have the decision of the body, and that decision is the output. That's the action that the organization is going to take. So that's the official action of your organization. And we can go to the next slide now. So a little more on the details. The preparation for organizations like this, you've got a great staff that prepares your agendas. Most of the motions are very detailed and specify exactly what they need, what needs to be done. If you're making a motion that's not on the agenda, if it's something you need to do just orally, that you can still do that. The main thing is to be clear and concise about the action that you want the organization to take. So your motion may be something like, Mr. Chairman, I move to extend the time for debate on item number 7 of the agenda to 10 minutes. That's your motion, and that's not the time to debate it. You make a motion after it receives a second, then it goes on to discussion. So a second, and just to clarify, that it says support, but when someone seconds a motion, they're supporting discussing it. Don't feel like you're bound to vote in favor of a motion just because you second it. Really what you're saying is, yeah, we should go ahead and discuss that. If no one in the room wants to discuss it, then it's not business that the organization needs to take up. Discussion, generally, everyone should have an opportunity to be heard, so the chair should try to recognize everyone during the discussion that wants to speak. And the best way to do it is start with the person who made the motion. So if you're the chair, it may sound something like, there's been a motion and a proper second. Mr. Smith, this was your motion. Would you like to open discussion? And then throughout the discussion, ideally you should try to let opposing sides alternate between opposing sides. Sometimes you know that just by who it is and what they're saying, or sometimes it gets fleshed out as the discussion evolves. But ideally, you want to let those in favor have a chance to rebut those who are speaking against a motion. And that just helps with the open flow of dialogue and actually fleshing out the details of what's being done. Once discussion is ended, usually it's pretty clear. People just stop raising their hands. The chair will ask for a vote. And at the end of the vote, the chair should announce the result of that vote, again, so that the record's clear. And it's just something as simple as, state what the motion is. There's been a motion to extend debate on item number 7 to 10 minutes. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay or no. And then the result would be the motion carries 5-0, or the motion fails 2 in favor, 3 against. Again, that's just a clear record of what the action was that the body took. We go to the next slide. So there's some common motions. The cheat sheet is a great guide, and I encourage you to utilize that. And the book is an even better guide, but the cheat sheet is good to have with you at the meeting. You don't want to have to try to thumb through the book. The book is a good, hey, after the meeting, I don't know how this worked, or maybe if you're preparing something before the meeting, you can look it up. But cheat sheet's good to have with you. The things that I'll point out just with common motions, there's really 2 classes of motions. There's the main motion and then subsidiary motions. So the main motion is what brings business, to the floor. And a subsidiary motion is essentially a motion about a motion. So if you want to amend the main motion, well, now if a motion is made and seconded to amend, that now becomes the business of the floor, and that takes precedence. So now we're focused on whether or not we're going to amend the motion and how we're going to amend it. That doesn't pass the main motion. Once the amendment is passed, you still have to vote on the main motion. If you're making an amendment, the advice there is to be very precise about what you're amending. I would like to strike these specific words and replace them with these words. Or I would like to add this sentence. Or I would like to change the amount from this to this. So be precise about exactly what it is you're amending. I want to point out the third one there, postpone and defer. Those are often used interchangeably. I would recommend not doing that. I think a better practice is to use postpone and defer for different purposes, so everyone's clear about what's happening. What you should strive to do is, if you have a motion before the floor and debate reveals that maybe it's not ripe for a vote yet, maybe there's some information that we need that we don't have in front of us, or we'd like some research and we want to just wait until the next meeting. The proper motion there would be defer until a certain time. I would like to defer until the next meeting, or defer until this specific date. Alternatively, you can postpone a motion indefinitely, but really what it does is it kills the motion. So there may be reasons why you don't want to, instead of just voting it down, maybe you don't want to vote no, maybe you just want to postpone it indefinitely, but it's not coming back up unless it gets filtered back through the staff process and put back onto the agenda someday down the road. There's no set time for it to come back up if you postpone it indefinitely. One you've probably heard before is a motion to table. A motion to table is generally used for putting something aside during that meeting with the intent to take it back up in that meeting. For your organizations, not very likely you're going to need that motion. Generally, you're going to defer it until a specific time, until a new meeting. Lay on the table is more common in civic organizations and things like that, where something comes up, it's a little more informal, let's just table this for a little bit, and we'll come back to it later in this meeting. But I don't suspect you would use it that often. More often you will defer something into a specific time. And then the last one, I'll point out the point of order. That's a helpful tool, and it can be used 2 ways. So a point of order is used to raise a procedural issue, and you can do that either saying if you perceive that something is out of order, you can bring it up, and it might sound like point of order, Mr. Chairman. I think that requires a second before it can go to discussion. Another way to do it is to ask a question. If you're not sure what the procedure is, say, point of order, Mr. Chairman, I don't think we should vote on this today. Should we defer it? Do I table it? What's the proper motion? So kind of two ways that you can use that. I think that's really the main things I wanted to cover. I'm open to any questions if there's something specific or looking at the cheat sheet somebody has a question about. Yes, sir.
Would you mind giving maybe an example of a motion to reconsider? Like, how well would that work after a motion has been voted?
Sure. I have one. I was at a meeting actually last night, and there was a motion to approve a site plan with certain conditions. However, and it got approved, and the planner realized that one of the conditions was actually supposed to be struck, and it got approved with a condition that wasn't proper. So that motion to reconsider can be made during the same meeting. It can't be made at a future meeting, but it can be made at that same meeting. So we got further on in the meeting, the planner realized he had made a mistake. It wasn't Micah. Micah wouldn't make that mistake. It was another planner that I work with. And so the planner whispered to me, oh, that we should have struck that. And so we got towards the end of the meeting. I buzzed in. I said, point of order. There's been an error. And so I'm recommending that we reconsider this. One of the planning commissioners made a motion to reconsider. There was a second. We talked about how it was a mistake. It was restated, and then it was approved the correct way. And so that would be an example of that, just recent, that came up last night.
Could the developer have brought that to the table?
Bit of what?
Could the developer out in the floor, could he have brought that up?
He couldn't, well, there's no rebuttal during those meetings, so actually what happened is the developer texted me and said, that's not a proper, that we weren't supposed to have that condition, that was a misunderstanding. So then I actually asked the planner, I whispered to the planner, I said, was there an error? And he looked, and in fact, there was an error. So that's how that was brought up. Yes, sir. Otherwise, we would have had to come back at a future meeting and handled it a month later, which was not good for anybody, including the planning commission, the developer, or the planner. So we were able to handle it on the floor in real time.
I have a question. So when an item 7B, whatever it is, should a motion be, first and second, be taken before any staff comments are read?
Yes, ma'am, I think so. I think what the proper procedure there would be, next item on the agenda is 7B. Do I hear a motion? Move to approve 7B or whatever that item is, receives a second. The item's open for discussion. We'll begin with staff reports. I
Okay.
think that would be the proper way to address it.
Thank you.
The rationale there, of course, is until the matter's properly before the body, it's just on the agenda. So it's not ripe for discussion yet until you have a motion and a second.
You wouldn't say motion to approve and then a motion second and then discuss. You would say motion to review or motion to read and discuss, correct?
Most bodies will use just a motion to approve to get it on the floor. They may not support, they may vote against it. That's not,
Approve to
it's not
get it-
binding.
A motion to approve to bring it to the floor.
The rules are not inflexible, but what
words
I've
are-
heard typically, and this may be contrary to your practice, and that's fine, because again, they're not hard and fast. Each town or city has their own spin on the rules. And so you try to reach a comfort level where you're complying, but realizing the language might be different. But for example, in Spring Hill, it will be a motion to approve item SP 193, and there'll be a second, and then there'll be a staff report, and then the developer will be allowed to speak, or the applicant will be allowed to speak, the representative, and then there'll be a discussion, and then there'll be a vote.
What if you don't get a second?
It dies on the floor.
It does.
So then he can't even talk about it, he can't even, the city can't even tell you what's going on, even though he could read it, right?
And And of course, that can be a problem with site plans because you owe it to under the law, I think you have 30 days once one is brought forth to vote on it one way or another. So, and I'm going to talk about, that's going to get into what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but.
Just to point out, when you make the initial motion to approve it, it's really more efficient, because if you move to discuss something and then you discuss it for a while, then you still have to move to approve it. So it's just a more efficient way to do it. You move to approve whatever it is, and now the item's open for however much discussion is required to resolve the issue.
So you're saying a motion to approve?
Yes.
Not saying a motion of approval?
A motion to approve.
Okay. And a second to ask to approve? Mm-hmm. Okay. Words are specific if you use them correctly, and I don't always do that. But
Well, that's why we're here, to try to make your jobs easier when we can, for sure, except when we make them more difficult, of course. One example, I said these rules aren't inflexible, but for example, I work with the city, and oftentimes they use motion to defer and motion to postpone as the same motion. And so I've encouraged them to say in 30 days or in 60 days, so there's a time for it to come back. If they want to just take it off indefinitely, in that case, in that city, they use a motion to table, which takes it off indefinitely, and it won't keep popping up on the agenda. So I think Mr. Hogan is correct about the technical differences about a motion to defer and a motion to defer, or a motion to defer and a motion to postpone. Some cities treat it as the same motion, and it works just fine. So everybody's comfortable, and you may have things like that we don't know yet, and we'll have to figure out as we go.
And that's the big takeaway that I neglected to mention in the output is, Robert's Rules is the guide, but your organization needs to adopt your own rules. You may have your own time limits for debate that you want to adopt, and you may make a certain type of motion, and everyone knows what that means, and it works well for your organization, and that's great, and you should do that. And Robert's Rules is the default when you don't have a specific rule. So that's the big takeaway.
And if we're confused about what the motion is, we may ask you to clarify or suggest an alternative motion that accomplishes what we think you're trying to do, and we can just have a discussion. You'll have to be, as we get up to speed with Fairview's practices, you may have to be patient with us in figuring out that comfort level, but we'll get there for sure.
Do we have to have a time limit for debate?
No, no. I think some matters deserve a lot more conversation than others. Interestingly enough, it seems like the most complicated matters usually get discussed the least, and the simplest matters get discussed the most. I think that's the practical nature of people understanding the simple thing more and wanting to speak, and then the $25 million bond for a highway or for a bridge or for whatever, no one understands the financial parts of it, so they just know they want the bridge. And so typically there's less discussion for the more important items. And I don't know if that's true here, but I find it true in just about every place I've been. But no, you don't have to have a time limit. And I think it comes down to due process and fairness and the applicant feeling like, even when what you really want is even when the applicant loses and doesn't get approved, they still feel like the process was fair. And that's the most important thing. That's why we're all here, is to have a fair process, to have due process. And if we follow these rules and we attempt to have a level playing field, we will get there. People will feel like the process was fair even when they don't get what they want.
With the items that we have on agendas, usually anything we have prepared comes with a resolution. In those resolutions, usually the wording is the City of Fairview Planning Commission hereby approves or denies the request with the following conditions. Would it be proper at the time of making the initial motion to go ahead and include each of those conditions as listed, or all conditions as listed, so that that's in the motion originally? Or would it be better to amend the motion once the discussion has happened for each of those conditions?
Typically what I see is the motion to approve with staff conditions, a second, and then there's a discussion, if there's a need to amend it and take out a condition or add a condition or add 5 conditions, then that can be done with an amendment.
And then one follow-up with that. Motion to approve versus motion to deny both have discussion after the point, correct?
Yes, I typically find a motion to, even when you intend to deny it, I think the best practice is always make a motion to approve. You're still free to vote against it and deny the project, but it can create confusion when you make a motion to deny and then vote no. It sometimes is counterintuitive. So I think the best practice, the least confusing practice, is always to make a motion to approve. Again, that doesn't bind you to cast an aye vote. You can still vote no when the item comes. And I just think that works out the best.
Mr. Hall had a question back there. If I can repeat it for you for people at home, or you can come to the microphone if you'd like.
I don't think it, substantively, I don't think it matters. It's just whatever your normal practice is and whatever your comfort is. But as long as you acknowledging that you support discussing the matter. So normally you just hear second.
Yeah.
Mr. Johnson, did you have a question?
Patrick, could you explain maybe to Haley and the rest of them, since we don't have anything that prohibits the length of discussion, the only thing that you could really end discussion early would be calling the question. That was not mentioned there.
Sure, yeah. If you look on the sheet that we passed out, that was in your book, on the left-hand side, end debate, and that's the way it's worded here is I move the previous question, but I move the question. There's lots of different ways you can state that. It all means the same thing. That's a vote that requires 2/3. So that's very useful if you have one member that just wants to keep discussing it ad nauseum, and everyone's ready to have the vote already, and so you're sure you'll get 2/3 support to call the question and actually have a vote. And so that stops someone from just filibustering, and where they just keep talking and repeating themselves. I'm sure none of you are like that. And surely none are on like that, the BOZA or the Board of Commissioners, but that's the motion. And very useful sometimes.
Any other questions? All right, we'll move on.
Perfect. Well, I have to give my wife credit because I've never created a PowerPoint, believe it or not. So she's the reason why it's as pretty as it is. And she threatened to come today. I told her she probably really didn't want to come. Not because of all you, but some of this can be kind of dry. Imagine that. Anyway, I've just called this 5 common legal issues that arise in land use planning. These apply equally to the Board of Commissioners, Planning Commission, and Board of Zoning Appeals. From what I've seen, there's really 3 places cities commonly get sued. They get sued for HR, human resources. That's just a common place where you'll have different types of lawsuits. The second common place is out of the police force. When you're policing and people are unhappy, you just tend to have suits. Pull over someone that has a DUI, even when they blow positive, then they file an action and say they were unlawfully detained or arrested, and we have insurance for that. The city has insurance for that. So that's another common place. The third place that's common for lawsuits to happen are out of the Board of Zoning Appeals because they're a quasi-judicial board, out of the Planning Commission, or land use decisions that come out of the Board of Commissioners, which mainly would be annexations or what am I thinking? Annexations or rezones typically is a popular place. But the 5 things we're going to talk about are disclosure, Tennessee Open Meetings Act, ex parte, contact, due process, and standard of review. So if you could go to the next slide. and we'll talk about disclosure. A couple different places this arises, when something's a voting matter, when something's just for discussion, and then the most unfortunate problem is when you have acceptance of gifts or other items of value, which sometimes happens in cities. Starting with C, acceptance of gifts and values, I had started a city attorney job, and within a few months, I found out or figured out that certain developers were handing out things for Christmas, including gift cards to staff members. Well, that didn't go over really well, and I put an end to that. So I was very unpopular because I had rained on that parade. But that's obviously, I think we all know that that's incorrect. But it happens. It's human nature. If someone tries to give you something of value, then it's important to say, no, I can't accept that, and return it. Okay? Obviously, if someone brings cookies and they're for everyone to share, for the department to share, you're not going to hear me. I don't think that's a problem, or something of that nature that has a de minimis value. But if a gift is personal to you, then you should not accept it, because it pulls into question your integrity. Once you accept it, they're only giving it to you because of the position you occupy. So if you have that question, and it occurs to you, that's what you should be thinking. Why are they giving this to me? Would they give it to me just because I'm a great person, or are they giving it to me because I sit on the Planning Commission or the Board of Zoning Appeals or the Board of Commissioners? And if that's the answer, then you should not accept it. You should tell them to take it, and you can be very thankful for it, but you should tell them to take it. And I've had this discussion with staff too, and I don't think it's a problem here in Fairview, but it's just a problem I've seen happen before. As far as disclosure of personal interest in voting matters or non-voting matters, I think those can be discussed together. As we were talking about before, the common thread in all of this is fairness. And when someone's treated fairly, even if they come up short, and even if they're disappointed, they know that there's been fair play, and there's likelihood little repercussions after that. They may be unhappy with the decision, but they knew it was fair. You know, when you probably everybody watched the Super Bowl, there was that penalty at the end, which lots of people were complaining about it, but you did not hear Philadelphia say, oh, we were cheated out of the game because of that ref call, because whether you like the call or not, the player even admits he tugged on the jersey, okay? And so it doesn't call into question the Super Bowl because the process was fair, and that's what we aim for here in the city. Oftentimes in Tennessee, when you talk about personal interest, it's about financial interest, okay? And so obviously all of us in the room, all of us that own property in Fairview, an impact of a zoning or annexation or a new business opening, it's gonna affect us all equally financially, you know, plus or negative. But when it tends to affect just you, you know, because of your job or because you have a financial interest in the company that's developing a piece of property, that's a conflict of interest. And that's a clear conflict of interest. So at that point, when the matter comes up, you should disclose the conflict of interest to the public over your microphone and just say, I have a conflict of interest. I'm not going to vote on this matter. And I would also say, even if it's just for discussion, you know, it's just a work meeting, you should refrain from discussing it. And I'll even go so far as to say it'd be appropriate to announce the conflict and then get off the podium and sit in the audience and don't even discuss it. Because when you do that, it puts you beyond reproach. And even if it's not a technical conflict, the biggest problems are with the appearance of a conflict, right? When we think someone's been bought or they're tainted somehow. And then that's when all the discussion starts, particularly in small towns, you know, and everybody's talking about it. So just remove yourself from it. I promise nothing that we do in the city individually is worth having your integrity called into question. So that's the best way to handle that. Does anyone have any questions about disclosure?
If you have to recuse yourself, do you have to say why you're recusing yourself?
No, you can just say I'm going to recuse myself from this vote. And some people will say I work for the company, I work for the engineer that is proposing this, but you don't have to. You can just say I have a conflict of interest, or I have a personal interest, and I'm going to recuse myself, and then step down. Yes. I think that's a good question. I think there's one of two ways you can handle that. You could disclose the conflict. I think in either case, you have to disclose the conflict. I think if you feel like you can vote on it fairly and honestly and not have that affect your vote, then I think you could vote. I think that's a possibility. I think the best thing to do, though, would be to disclose the conflict and step down and not vote. I think it's at least the appearance of a conflict and probably a direct conflict. If you have the Adidas store and Nike's coming in and you just vote no, just to vote no because you don't want the competition, I think you're opening yourself up to criticism and calling into question your integrity. And so I think that's a good question. And I think my advice would be to step down, announce the conflict and step down. Okay? Can we go to the next slide? Everybody good? Okay. Next slide. This is the Tennessee Open Meetings Act. I'm sure you've all heard of this. This is the Tennessee version of the federal act, which is the Federal Open Meetings Act. Basically, a meeting of commissioners are a meeting of two or more, and it can be commissioners, it can be planning commissioners, it can be BOZA members. So it applies to whether you're elected or whether you're appointed. And that's a meeting of two or more. And it doesn't matter if the meeting is via a live meeting in person. It doesn't matter if the meeting is at the back of Publix. You know, when you see someone getting a sub at Publix and you start discussing a project, that's a meeting. That's an illegal meeting. It doesn't matter if it's over email. It doesn't matter if it's over text. It doesn't matter if it's over Zoom. It's an illegal meeting. If there hasn't been public notice, and we don't have a quorum, and there hasn't been due process or fairness, and that's a meeting. And it happens all the time, and sometimes it happens accidentally. You know, someone will send an email, and they'll be like, well, I'm going to discuss this. Well, once you do that, you're opening, as soon as someone replies, then you have a meeting. So it is, again, the appearance of a conflict is almost worse than the actual conflict. So and now that doesn't mean to say that if you're getting subs at Publix and another commissioner comes in, Mr. Butler comes in and Mr. McDonald's buying a sub, just don't discuss city business or don't talk at all, but that would be kind of weird, I think. But you could say hello, but you should not discuss city business or something that's coming up. And if you really want to be careful, then just avoid that situation. Now, listen, Fairview's a friendly city, and I don't want to change that, but we don't want to give the public the idea that business is not being conducted in public, because that's where the public's business should be conducted, in an open room like this, where it's been noticed, it's recorded, it's live broadcast. And so we don't want to give anyone the idea that business is being conducted behind closed doors. And I think as long as you keep that in mind, then most of it will follow as far as what you shouldn't be doing, okay? One of the reasons why it's important to do, yes, sir?
That's deeper than I think everybody realizes, or in my opinion anyway. A neighbor comes up and asks me what my opinion is about this or that. I tend to not want to tell them because if they ask, they've usually got an opinion. And I really don't want to hear their opinion, but I want to be nice to them.
Well, if your neighbor's not an elected official, you can talk to your constituents anytime you want. It's just elected or appointed officials.
Okay, but
But there's probably another reason why you shouldn't share your opinion with your neighbor, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes.
because I agree with what
So, but does everyone understand the difference? So when we're talking about this particular law, we're talking about if you're elected or appointed. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And so, and I have debate or deliberate. I mean, that's what we do in an open meeting. So, if the public gets here and you have a meeting and then everyone votes, 7-0 with no debate, that doesn't smell quite right. It seems like Well, what happened there? There was no discussion at all. And so that's why it's important to discuss and deliberate. And this is our chance to do it, while we're in front of everybody. If you feel like you need to have a conversation, it's like our parents used to tell us, if you feel like you have to whisper or keep something a secret, you probably don't need to be talking about it anyway. So it just gets you in trouble. Adequate notice.
I think we had a question back
Yeah,
here.
I'm sorry. It's hard to keep track of everybody. Yeah, cross-board, still same problem. Same problem. Staff is fine to talk to. You can talk to staff all day long, whether they want to or not. That's what you're paying them for. So staff or attorneys or? Yep. There's no conflict of interest of someone calling me. Oftentimes what would happen, for example, Mayor Anderson has a question. She can talk to Micah and say, hey, this is what I'm wondering, and Micah can reach out to each of you individually. You should not send a group email because group emails are an invitation, and they're the worst way this happens, right? Group emails are terrible, but Micah can individually poll each of you and ask you what you think, and then he can report back to Ms. Anderson. But there should not be a group email where there's open discussion that's not in public, okay? That help?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carter, if, say there's an advisory board, like the Parks and Landscape Board, is it okay for 2 board members to attend that meeting?
2 Board of Commissioners or 2 BOZA members to attend the meeting? Their meeting?
It's, like the Parks and Landscape Board is an advisory board that meets. Is it okay if 2 board members, BOC members, like myself and somebody else, attend that meeting?
So this Open Meetings Act also applies to advisory boards because they're appointed, right? You get appointed to an advisory board. So they have to, they can't just meet impromptu. They also have to have scheduled meetings that are noticed. It is fine for people to come to the meetings as long as they don't start talking together or deliberating an issue. So,
There are things discussed during that meeting.
but it's a public meeting though.
Agenda items are different. If it's an agenda item, they can still discuss it.
It's an open meeting. The Open Meetings Act applies to it. So if you attend, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Cali, is that pronouncing that right? If you both attend and you're participating in the meeting, that's fine because it's an open meeting. It's been advertised and there's a process to it.
Okay, thank you.
It's problematic if you and Mr. Cali, how do I say it? Cali, okay. I know Collies in Columbia and they're Coolley. But anyway, if you go into the back room and just start discussing an issue with him, then that's a problem, because that's not, you're doing it in private again.
It's just been a question in the past, so I thought while we're discussing this, it could be
No, I
brought
think it's
up.
a good
Because
question.
somebody's usually appointed to that board from, the BOC, and so if, say, I wanted to attend one of their meetings, it is an open meeting, so.
No problem.
There
Anyone
wouldn't be a
can
problem
attend.
for all of us to attend it.
No problem at all.
Okay.
Okay? Adequate notice, typically, the law doesn't define adequate notice. Typically, I say it's 5 days. Sometimes it's 3 days. Sometimes you'll have something added to the agenda the day of. We try to give the public as much notice as possible, okay? And try to do our job. Meeting minutes, that's another notice issue, right? We keep track of what we talk about, and then we vote on those minutes to the next meeting. So the public knows what we're doing. We're here to do the public's business, and so that's another way we communicate with the public. Next slide, please. So this gets to your point, Mr. Anderson, when you have a neighbor come up and talk to you and want you to obligate yourself to a particular side. That's always dangerous because it means you made up your mind before the issue is discussed. That happens a lot with land use proposals, where, how do you feel about this apartment complex? Well, I'm totally against it. Well, I don't know how you can be totally against it because you haven't heard the debate yet. That's fine if you reach that conclusion after the public debate. but you should really be careful about letting someone push you into the corner and obligate yourself to one position or another, whether the person's a neighbor or whether the person's a developer or whoever. And they all try to do it. I mean, you're elected or appointed, and everyone's trying to get in your ear to figure out what you're going to do because they have some sort of interest in it. But you should refuse to make up your mind until we've had a debate and discussion in public, okay? And I think if you think about that, it makes good sense. If this happens a lot too, where someone will come up and they'll say, "Hey, here's some information." They're trying to give you information. You should not take that information, you should either not take the information or insist they pass it to everybody, okay? Or tell them that you're going to pass it to everybody. But it's not a good look, and it doesn't breed fairness and due process when, suddenly we're at a meeting and suddenly you have all this information that's inside information, you start reading off of it, because it calls into question your relationships and whether the work's actually being done in public, okay? Sometimes it may be useful to do a review of a site. For example, with some of these larger projects, the developer may have built a similar project somewhere else and they want to show it to you. You should refuse to get involved in that. What you should do is come to the meeting, and when you do roundtable, I think they call it communication from the commission, and you can at that point discuss it or tell Micah, "Hey, I think it'd be a good idea to go and look at this site," and at that point, the body can discuss who gets appointed to go visit the site, okay? And again, written or electronic information should be available to all members. If someone sends you something, that's the thing with electronic communications. Once you send it, the cat's out of the bag. Like, you can't tell them no because you already have it. At that point, you should send it to your planner, Micah, and ask him to make sure everybody has a copy of it in their packet. It'd be inappropriate for you to send it to all the other members, because then we get into the other problem of communications that may not be proper under the Tennessee Open Meetings Act, okay? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I kind of amen that. I have received emails and phone calls from people in the past about certain things that they're passionate about. I tend to think that people that take the time to write lengthy emails don't usually never show up to talk about it. And so therefore, behind the computer, they're very enthusiastic, but in public, they're not. They're sheepish. And if it's that important, I think they need to come to the forum. But I personally don't like the emails that come from an individual or group that's trying to sway me one way or another. I'd rather them present it here, and I don't tend to read those because I don't want to be prejudiced before I come here. I really don't like that at all. I mean, we got a simple task. The city has a process, and I think if we sit there and read this and get in the car and go check this one out and go check that one out, and not getting both sides of the story, and if I see it and read it, then I got questions. Then if I call Micah or one of our other people, which logically you would want to do, then you're in trouble with the Open Meetings Act. Now, Micah can answer my question, but I still just think that if the person is that passionate about what they're trying to tell us, they need to come and present it to the board, or write a open letter that our staff will pre-read, and then give us a synopsis of that story or whatever they're offering. I do not like them coming to me personally.
I couldn't agree more. People are really brave behind a keyboard. I've heard about the Fairview Then and Now Facebook site. Every Columbia has a version of that, and so does Spring Hill. And it's most people wouldn't say what they say when they type it in person, because most people have been brought up with better manners than that. So I agree with you on that, and I think an appropriate response is, thanks for your input. You might want to come to the meeting if you want to be heard on it. And so I think that's the best way to handle it. Does everyone else get that pressure of people wanting you to hear this or hear that, or want you to commit to a vote beforehand. Yeah, that's dangerous territory for elected officials or appointed officials because it doesn't breed fairness. So, next slide is due process, and this kind of generally underlies everything we talked about, but the elements are notice, opportunity to be heard, and then fairness, not wisdom. It's always great if we can have wisdom, right? But we don't, we're not always in control of wisdom, either ourselves or the people that come talk to us, and we have to listen to them. But we can make sure the process is fair. We can't always make sure it's wise, but we can always make sure it's fair. The word due process appears in the Constitution a couple times. The Fifth Amendment, nor be deprived of life, liberty, property without due process of law. 14th Amendment, nor shall state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process is the underpinning that underpins democracy and trust in the process. And super important that we get there and have as much trust in the process as possible. You'll always have people that are conspiracists that just won't believe anything, and that's fine. They're entitled to believe that, but we should always strive to be better, okay? And finally, just briefly, standards of review, next slide. Generally, we have legislative body and administrative bodies. An example of the legislative body is the body that makes the law. In this case, it's the Board of Commissioner in Fairview. We pass ordinances. Generally, legislative bodies affect lots of people with their decisions, right? We pass an ordinance and it affects all the citizens. Administrative bodies, examples of those in the city would be the Board of Zoning Appeals or the Planning Commission. And they're not elected, they're appointed, and the result of their decisions typically are very dialed into one particular person or one particular developer or one particular piece of property, okay? And sometimes when I say one person, it can be a company or whatever, but the focus is much more narrow. Administrative bodies do not make law. They're ministerial in nature, which means they apply the existing law. So, for example, if you have a site plan that comes and the Planning Commission has to approve a site plan or deny the site plan, the standard of review is looking at the standards the city has set in the zoning ordinance or in the PUD, which is a custom zoning for that particular piece of property, and if it meets all the standards, you have to approve it. You have to. You can't say, well, I don't like the density of this, or I don't like the style of this, or I don't appreciate this about the neighborhood, or that ship has sailed. When the property is rezoned, which is what the legislative body does, or the property is annexed, which is what the legislative body does, once they do that and the property is given a zone, if the proposed development meets all the standards of that zone or of that PUD, then the Planning Commission has to approve it. The public often doesn't understand that. And there's lots of pressure to vote no on things that you have to vote yes on. But the best lawyer will not be able to get you out of that trouble once you deny something that should have been approved. So once Mike, and this is why you have paid staff, so once the city attorney, Micah, your planner, your engineer, Ms. Toddy, the engineer, say, hey, it meets all our city standards. It meets all of the requirements under that zone, you have to approve it. You can't vote it down. Now, when the legislative body undertakes an annexation or undertakes hearing a rezone, the burden on that is it's much less. You just have to have a rational basis. So if you well, I don't like that zoning for this piece of property, it doesn't fit with our 2040 growth plan, it's too much density in that part of the city, the roads really aren't up to snuff according to what the engineer says, so we're not going to approve that rezoning. The city has a lot of leverage at that point. They have a lot of leverage on rezonings, annexations, and once that law is made, whether you approve or deny the annexation, the burden is then on the affected person to say that the process was not fair or there was no rational basis for it, which is a really high standard. So the leverage the city has on a lot of these projects is at the rezoning or the annexation stage. You know, once you get a plan at the planning commission, it's ministerial in nature. You know, there's not a lot of thinking. The thinking is, does it meet the standards? If it meets the standards, you have to approve it, okay?
Mr. Carter, just to let
Yeah.
you know, we're about 4 minutes away from 7.
Almost finished. I was going to talk about Board of Zoning Appeals. So we talked about Board of Zoning Appeals. There's a statute that tells you what the standard process, what the standard is for a variance, for example. There, you know, it's inherent to the land itself. So is it exceptionally narrow? Is the topography where the property is not buildable? That's what you have to look at, and that's dictated by law. So if it meets the standards of a variance, you have to give the variance. If it doesn't meet those standards, it's not. You know, you get a lot of people treat Board of Zoning Appeals like, you know, kind of like, well, if the property's not, if the zoning doesn't allow it, then I'm going to ask for a variance to build my pool, even though it doesn't fit in the lot line. Well, in most cases, the person bought the property knowing where the lot line was and knowing what the setbacks were, so it would not be appropriate to give a variance for a pool in that case. Now, the landowner won't like that, but that's following the law. So long and short of it is, I think it's really important, if you do what you're supposed to do, whether you sit on the Board of Commissioners or whether you sit on an administrative body, and follow the standard of review, and you give it credence, you won't get sued. Now, if you ignore what you were appointed to do and don't follow the standard, you'll get sued. And there's not a lot the city attorney or staff can do at that point, because you've made your bed. I'll wrap up. I don't know if there's any quick questions. Well, it's good to be here, everybody. So we're ready for our meeting. Micah has my cell phone. The Board of Commissioners all have my information. I don't think I have the Planning Commissioner's information, but Micah can get that for me, and happy to have, you have my office number and cell phone number and email, and if you want to discuss about this or anything else after the fact, happy to do it.
Any other last-second questions anybody has? We've got about 2 minutes. We will take a break. We'll come back at 7:04 and start the meeting, 5 minutes.